Hi, it's Jeff Hopper again with Lynx Players President Jeffrey Cranford, and we are here discussing spiritual due diligence.
Spiritual due diligence.
Yep, and we're on our fourth study, which is the nature of Scripture, and we are now to Lesson 2. And Lesson 2, Jeff, talks about the variety of writing that we find in Scripture. I'm a writing guy and a literature guy and taught that and practice it and all of that, and so I'm always excited to find in Scripture a variety. There's historical writing, there's poetic writing, there's prophetic writing, there are these doctrinal writings that are there, and so we find all that, and it's kind of like there's something for everybody.
Absolutely. And a lot of people look at the fullness of the Scripture and they say, well, this is just man written. And I remember the quote, so famous that I don't remember at the moment who actually made the quote, but he said, look, if God didn't write the Bible, then whoever put it together is God. I mean, it's because it's
right.
And one of the really frustrating parts is once you understand the totality of all the writings and how they come together so seamlessly into this 66 book document that we have, 39 Old Testament books, what we'd call the Old Testament, or a Jewish believer might call the Tanakh, or a Jewish person might call the Tanakh, and the New Testament. And when you put them together, it's written over at least a 1,500-year period of time, and how beautifully they come together, it's just almost unimaginable that this wasn't God ordained. And some of the accusations that this is just man-made documents, the more you study it and the more you recognize the variety of both the writings, as you refer to, and the Scripture itself, and what a large period of time and how cohesive it is, it gives you great confidence in living your life by the Word.
Oh, absolutely. Now, before we get too much into how these things meld together, which is a little bit of our look in the next lesson, let's talk about some of these separate parts. We know we have historical writings, and sometimes I personally have a little bit of a hesitation to call those stories. A lot of people will call them stories because in our culture, story, that word conjures up the idea of fiction a lot of times. Correct. So I will I'll use the term accounts.
Correct.
Because these are verified history in so much of Scripture is made up of verified history. Certainly the beginning of the Old Testament, threaded through other parts of the Old Testament,
Correct.
And then into the Gospels. Those are things that actually happen. So that's a powerful piece of Scripture.
And in our culture today, those things seem to continually come up for debate. And one of the places that we always start is what was the very first place that Satan attacked? What was the very first deception? And it was found in the garden. And the very first things he did, this very first piece of trickery was, has God really said that? Which was his first call.
Right.
And that strategy continues throughout the last thousands of years, through the millennia, to today. Has God really said that? And so as you become a student of the variety of the various writings, and you begin to become accustomed and recognize what a synergy there is among all the different writings, again, it bolsters your faith and gives you great confidence in not only just reading the Bible, but actually beginning to live out its precepts.
Then we have these more poetic sections, what our Jewish friends call the wisdom books.
Correct.
Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon. Very, very different in terms of what people might be looking for from those things. And we're told, well, don't build doctrine based on those, and yet we know that those are equally inspired parts of Scripture.
Yeah, and as we'll talk about in the next segment, Jesus emerges in all of those various segments.
Yeah.
And the prophetic sense of that he's coming. So within Scripture, you can obviously open, and one of the great places, by the way, if you have a Lynx Fellowship going, a great place to start is just in Proverbs chapter 1. You have a year or 2 years worth of material, great to go around the table on if you've got 3, 4, 5, 10 guys or women or whatever, and just go through the Proverbs one by one. It's incredibly instructional, and it gives you a taste of the Messiah who's coming as well.
Yeah. And then, of course, that moves us to the prophetic writings, which I know are a favorite of yours, and those do so much forward pointing, and a lot of people have difficulty unpacking prophetic passages, and yet they're very powerful, aren't they?
And I think everybody has a a difficulty in unpacking that. Even during the time of Jesus, it was trying to understand when was Messiah come, what would he do, and the zealots thought if Jesus was the Messiah, and many were convinced that he was, why wasn't he taking over Rome? And so they were interpreting some of these prophetic writings in their day, in their time. There's always a propensity to do that, and I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with that and trying to see that in your time. But it's difficult sometimes to be dogmatic unless it's already been fulfilled, and those prophecies that have been fulfilled in Jesus, many of those. And that's just such an amazing portion of Scripture is the prophecies. And I've told many of our folks before and said very publicly, I don't think that I would still be a follower of Jesus if it weren't for the prophets. Because it gives me such an intellectual stability and an anchor in a 21st century secular world. As I go back to the prophets and go, wow, God's been talking about this for years.
Right. Yeah. And then we push past the histories of the Gospels and Acts, and we move into these doctrinal writings, these letters from the apostles to the early church. And certainly those are so often read as not just instruction to those people 2,000 years ago, but instruction to us personally.
Absolutely. And, I always try to you take some of our smaller links groups here in the Valley, and we'll get together with 20 or 30 guys, and we'll sit down, and I say, now, this is Corinthians, but I want you to put, one of our groups, so the Coachellans or whatever, or the Red Door, put your name in there. Imagine this is being written to you in your day as a personal application. Not everything will apply. There were some things that were cultural to their time. But most often those things, be an ambassador of Christ, reconcile, all these different things, put your name in there. Or if you're reading some of these pastoral letters that I'm sure you're going to get to next that are written to very specific individuals like Timothy or Titus,
right.
Imagine that Paul's writing that to you as a young man. Or imagine that you're trying to take that and you breathe that in, and it becomes really a letter to you.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, and one of the things that I often pray is, as we prepare to teach in a fellowship setting, is that thanking God for the living, active nature of His Word, and that's what we hope you find as you continue this study in spiritual due diligence.
And I will say this: Jesus and God says this as well. Jesus said, "My words are spirit, and they are life."
Yeah.
And certainly that's been my experience. I think it's been your experience as well. His words are actually life.